When we talk about the Second World War, most people focus on armies, tactics and battlefields. But behind every military line stood millions of civilians whose struggle was every bit as intense as the soldiers fighting on the front. These were people who lived through cities burned to ash by night raids, winters without food, years without seeing loved ones, and the dread of never knowing whether tomorrow would come. And yet they endured. The real question is how. What mental strategies, sometimes intentional, sometimes instinctive, kept ordinary families alive during daily chaos? Today, we're diving straight into the psychological survival systems civilians used to hold themselves together under bombing campaigns, starvation blockades, and prolonged social isolation. For anyone interested in European history, wartime psychology, and practical resilience, this isn't just a story. It's a field manual built on the hard lessons of people who paid for knowledge with their own lives. Let's get into it. Civilians survived bombings by building strict mental routines that reduced panic and kept the mind disciplined even when the world felt unstable. Across Britain, Germany, Poland and the Soviet Union, civilians who endured constant air raids often described the same thing. Routine became the anchor. The bombing might be unpredictable, but their actions were not. Families created fixed sequences they followed the moment the sirens wailed. This wasn't just procedure, it was mental armor. The repetition prevented panic because the brain leaned on familiarity rather than fear. In London's East End, families rehearsed their raid sequence every night. Children grabbed blankets, adults carried water bottles, one person checked the stove, another locked the door. In German cities facing Allied bombing, people went to shelters so frequently that entire social micro-communities formed underground. People sat in the same places every night, spoke to the same neighbours, and even developed shelter etiquette. So, the lesson for modern survivalists is clear. When stress spikes, structured action beats emotional reaction every time. If you live in an area prone to conflict, disaster, or even severe weather, you should really create a fixed response sequence for emergencies. And, well, practice it until it becomes muscle memory. During the Second World War, order didn't just protect bodies, it stabilized minds. Civilians survived starvation by adopting psychological reframing and communal food-sharing models that kept morale from collapsing, even when rations ran thin. Starvation destroys more than the body, it destroys willpower. Yet civilians in Leningrad, the Warsaw Ghetto, rural Greece and the occupied Netherlands found ways to keep going, even when daily calories dropped well below what anyone would call survival levels. One widespread mental tactic was reframing hunger, not as an individual misery but as a collective duty. People reminded each other, that the community was enduring together and that hunger was only temporary, but surrender, well, that was permanent. In diaries from the Leningrad blockade, many civilians describe how they coped by focusing on tasks, maintaining stoves, clearing snow, finding firewood, because, honestly, having purpose distracted the mind from pain. Food sharing also functioned as a psychological lifeline. In many occupied areas, families pooled their small resources because eating together, even if it was just a little, reinforced the feeling of not being alone. Even symbolic gestures mattered. A grandmother giving a child a piece of stale bread she could barely spare wasn't just survival. It was a preservation of humanity in conditions meant to erase it. Modern application of this lesson is powerful. When resources are low or times are difficult, psychological survival improves when people treat scarcity as a shared challenge instead of isolated suffering. If you want to apply World War II resilience today, build community resilience structures, shared meals, group tasks during hard times, and work systems that keep people focused on achievable goals. Civilians survived isolation by deliberately cultivating micro-communities and maintaining small, stable social rituals that protected mental health when the outside world, felt hostile or even unreachable. Isolation during the Second World War wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Men were at the front, families were separated, borders closed, letters censored, and, entire towns cut off. Civilians adapted by creating what psychologists today call micro-communities, tiny, stable circles of trust within chaos. These groups might be as small as 3 women who drew water from the same well each morning, or, say, a few elderly neighbours who checked on one another after raids. People created rituals like weekly gatherings, shared chores, or reading aloud in shelters. These rituals didn't just pass time. They anchored identity when everything else was unstable. A strong example comes from Norway under occupation. Civilians held silent resistance gatherings, where people met for an hour just to sit, talk quietly, and remind one another that occupation had not broken their social fabric. In France, small underground reading groups, or church gatherings, weren't only political or religious. They kept people's minds active and reminded them that the war had not stripped away culture. For modern readers, the application is straightforward. Isolation, whether from conflict, crisis, or even modern digital lifestyles, becomes survivable when you create consistent, meaningful contact with a small group. Civilians survived by giving themselves purpose, even when that purpose was small, repetitive, or, just symbolic. Purpose is honestly one of the strongest protective forces in extreme conditions. In wartime diaries from across Europe, people repeatedly mention that having a responsibility, even something as simple as boiling water for the shelter or reading news bulletins aloud, kept them mentally intact. Purpose counters fear because it gives the mind a direction. Without it, hopelessness creeps in. Today, this translates directly into modern resilience practice. Give yourself concrete tasks during crisis. They don't have to be heroic. They just have to be consistent. Civilians survived by maintaining dignity, identity, and, those small cultural rituals that reminded them of who they were before the war began. Families kept photographs even when they had to abandon everything else. Mothers braided their daughters' hair before taking them into shelters. Fathers told the same bedtime stories by candlelight during blackouts. These rituals were not sentimental extras. They kept people psychologically connected to their identity. Without identity, the mind drifts toward despair. In a modern survival scenario, keeping a sense of normalcy, even small things like a daily routine, a hobby, or a shared story, helps preserve mental stability. If you want more deep dive history delivered with real lessons, make sure you subscribe to Warpaths of Europe and share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. Your support keeps this channel alive and helps bring more untold stories to the community.